So first of all, Dr. Meister, thank you very much to you and to the Institute of Economic Affairs for having me here. This is an institute that has gathered a very good reputation for itself over the last years, and it's a great honor and pleasure to come here and talk about the work that I do, but in the context of what could be done here in Ghana. And I come literally just from my meeting with the President and the Vice President. And the reason I established this governance initiative is very, very simple. It's that I did these 10 years in government, and I learned a lot from it. I mean, one of the things that's very strange about government is that you're not allowed to say what is true. I don't mean that just generally, but I mean in this context, that I remember when I first came into government, and after about a year I wanted to go out and make a speech and say to people, look, you know, I'm kind of learning at this thing, you know, it'll get better as it goes on. And you know, my press people unsurprisingly said, if you say that, people are going to panic in the country. Everyone thinks you know what you're doing. But the truth about government is that it's both very complex, very difficult, and it's completely different from campaigning to be government. And I was just saying with the President now, I reminded him of the statement which I always quote from Mario Cuomo, who was the governor of New York, and he said that in politics, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And it's absolutely true. So out of the 10 years, I came to realize that there were certain lessons in how you governed, in the methodology of governing, that apply virtually whatever the country's circumstances and irrespective of any ideology, left, right, center, wherever you are. And in my second term in office, I then changed the way that the center of government worked, better to reflect what I thought was the central challenge which I discovered about governing, which is the challenge of implementation. In other words, taking a vision and turning it into a reality. And it's the clash between rhetoric and reality that is the single most difficult thing about governing. And so what I tried to do now is to distill those lessons, including the reforms of structure at the center of government, in order that, frankly, that newly elected presidents and prime ministers can go up the learning curve faster because they're taking advantage of my mistakes. Right? And, you know, these are basically, I'll just outline them for you. These are the lessons that I learned, and then we can have a discussion about it. But the very first thing about government is how you actually organize the infrastructure around the decision maker. This seems completely ridiculous or trivial as a point. But actually, we often do an analysis for the new presidents or prime ministers we work on, which we measure this. What are their priorities? And when it comes to their schedule, how much of their time do they spend on their priorities? And it's unbelievable how little time they actually spend on their priorities. Because here's the thing about governing. Everyone wants to see you. You've got interest groups. You've got constituents. You've got foreign dignitaries. You've got all manner of different people you've got to see, things you've got to do. You've got your protocol. And I always say to people, the first things I say to any new president is a happy protocol is the sign of a bad government. Because these guys, happy protocol is the sign of a bad government. These guys would always have you meetings from the early morning to the late at night. Governance is about execution. It's about getting things done. And if you're spending all your time just chatting, then you're spending all your time on the politics and not really on the policy delivery. So that's the first thing. How do you create a proper infrastructure around it. Seems trivial, but actually is absolutely fundamental. Second thing is, there is one big advantage today in government, which is around the world, people are facing the same problems. So people in Ghana may think that the issues to do with power infrastructure or education or agricultural smallholders or how do you get foreign investment into the country or how do you balance the budget, you may think these are specifically Ghanaian problems. They're not. Lots of countries have the same problems, different circumstances, but basically the same types of question arise. And the thing about government today is you can learn the best lessons from around the world. Some people are doing it well, some people are doing it badly. There is an experience, accumulated experience, in the profession of governance where lessons can be learnt and distilled. And, the important thing is to realize that I would say today the single most important determinant of a country's success is the quality of its governance. Because everything else is mobile. But that's the thing that's either working in the country or is not. So let me give you some examples of countries that are right next door to each other, same resources, roughly same population, therefore same opportunities. One succeeds, one fails. Colombia and Venezuela. Poland and Ukraine. One now a successful part of the European Union, the other struggling, as we know. Here in Africa, Rwanda and Burundi. Okay. And the greatest experiment in governance the world has ever seen, which is on the Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea. Okay, so what is the difference in each case? The difference is how it's governed. So the point is today, the best ideas are there, they just have to be accessed. Thirdly, when you then come to certain specifics, these lessons are very clear. Investment. It's absolutely clear what works and what doesn't. Predictable rules, transparently applied, with the minimum of bureaucracy. If you want business to come, in those circumstances, they'll come. If you put a whole lot of bureaucracy in place, if there's corruption, if people think that they can't get a proper answer out of government, make things work, they're not going to come. And by the way, today, there's billions and billions of dollars of footloose capital searching for places to invest. So those countries that set their stall out properly on investment can get that money. Fourth, today more than ever before, infrastructure matters. Now, infrastructure has always mattered. It's always helpful to have proper transport systems. It's always a good idea to have the right rail and road and airport. It's always been a good idea to have as much electricity as possible. But today, infrastructure is absolutely vital because infrastructure means connectivity. And today the world works through connectivity. So actually today, to have a functioning power generation and distribution system is absolutely essential because people get connected, they get connected by technology. But you can't use the technology unless you have the electricity. Likewise, if you again look at the countries that manage to succeed, they make sure that they are connected to the world. They're easy to get to. When they get to a country, they're made to feel welcome, and the infrastructure is there to make that connectivity successful. Again, and fifth, education. You were right, that's what I said, education, education, education. Actually, when I said that, which I think was back in 1994 or 5, I would say over 20 years on, you can multiply its importance several times. Today, what is absolutely essential is that we educate our people to the highest possible quality. And in particular, we teach our young people to think creatively. Right? So it's not just a question of putting a whole lot of kids in a classroom. I mean, that you can do, and you can tick that box and say we've got the enrollment up, but it's teaching of quality. Now, here's the interesting thing. Around the world, I can think of states in India I can think of different countries in the developing world, including some here in Africa, where they've reformed their education system and they've made real strides forward. Right? So those lessons are there and they can be learned. Likewise with healthcare, by the way. So how do you bring healthcare to developing nations? Very, very difficult when you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the qualified nurses and doctors and so on. But actually, again, around the world, some people are making it work. So how do you learn the lessons and how do you implement them? Agriculture. What we find so often in Africa is you get large numbers of people employed in agriculture, but the efficiency of the agricultural sector is such that you're still importing basic foodstuffs when all of the countries like Ghana should frankly be self-sufficient in everything they want and probably be exporting. But again, there are good ideas from around the world as to how agricultural programs can be made to be more efficient, how they can reach more people, how they can get produce, the factors of production up, and how therefore they can benefit the people. And then finally, just running through these things very quickly. So you need the right infrastructure around the decision maker. You need to get in the best ideas. And some of the areas that I've talked about are areas where, as I say, there's very good practice that you can learn from around the world. The final thing is what I addressed a little earlier in my remarks, which is the methods of implementation and delivery. Now, when I was in government, we pioneered, we changed the system of government at the centre. We pioneered a concept which is the delivery unit. And basically, what that was supposed to do was to take the absolutely core priorities of, in my case, the Prime Minister, but in this case it would be the President, and say, how do we make sure that those priorities are implemented, actually done, so that even though there may be 250 different things that the government's trying to do, these ones that are absolutely core to the success of the government are implemented. And so we created a structure that gave us what I call the 4 Ps. Okay? The first is a process of prioritization. And that's far harder than it sounds, by the way, because everything's a priority. You know, when I made my speech saying education, education, my top 3 priorities, education, 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 I'll never forget it. Next day, someone stops me and says, so does healthcare not matter then? It's a perfectly obvious response, but the point is, in the end, you have to prioritize. When I come across countries with a World Bank report that says, you know, Vision 2030, or I come across some that say Vision 2050, I just put my head in their hands. Because there's no way you're going to do all that. It might be absolutely, all of these things could be completely worthwhile, but you'll never manage to do it all. So, and one of the things you learn in government is how fast time passes. You know, before you know it, you're into the next election cycle. So you've got to be able to get that thing moving fast, and that requires prioritization. That's the first P. The second P is, once you prioritize, you've then got to get the right policy. You know, one of the things I learned again in government is for my first 2 or 3 years, if I had a priority, I would accept the system as it was, and then I used to come along and beat it over the head, the system, to make it work harder. And whilst I was beating it, by the way, it did work a bit harder. But when I stopped beating it, it stopped working. Right? So I realized that after a time, I was approaching this in the wrong way, that I had to get a policy that reformed the system, right? And that put in place the right incentives and structures that allowed that delivery to start what I would call self-perpetuating. Okay, so that it wasn't, you didn't continually have to come back and make it happen. So you've got to prioritize, you've got to get the policy right. The third thing is, you know, there's a certain way in which government is like a business. Now, everyone always objects when you say that, because they say, no, I mean, government's to do with the people, and business is to do with profit, and blah, blah, blah. Of course, in some ways that's true. But in other ways, government is like a business. In other words, you can run it efficiently or you can run it inefficiently. Right? So if you take something like procurement, okay, government goes and buys 100 tables. It's no different from a business buying 100 tables. They can buy them sensibly or they can buy them stupidly. Right? Now, you know, performance management is how companies deliver results. In other words, once they come to their ambition and they know what they're going to do, they then track it and monitor it all the way. So the other thing that we did with this delivery unit was kept on top all the time of our priorities, that what we said was supposed to happen was actually happening. And if it wasn't happening, we knew why it wasn't happening and we could go and correct. And then finally, which is absolutely a statement of the blindingly obvious, but it's amazing how people just in government particularly miss it, is personnel. Right? You know, any organization is as good as its people. I mean, it's a cliche, but the reason it's a cliche is because it's true. And so that's those 4 Ps, which are prioritization, policy, performance management, and personnel. Those are the things that I think make the central government work or not. So anyway, this is what I, spend my time working on with different governments around the world. But it's an interesting thing. Reason I brought everything together, because the Africa Governance Initiative is still going strong as the Africa Governance Initiative, but it's housed within one not-for-profit institute today. Because the different bits of work that I do, for example, in the Middle East, I want everything to be kind of brought together. But the interesting thing is, as I've started to bring them together, you realize that all the problems are pretty much the same. And actually, in today's world, the most important thing is to have the imagination to go out and connect with what is excellent out there. And just to finish on this point, what I've learned, and it's a bit of a tragedy for politics, but I think it's a product of the way the world's changing and the way politics is such a fierce battle today. The actual reality is the best ideas about government are often not to be found in the narrow world of politics. And one of the things I think is really important, if I was back in government today, I would have a whole wing of my government that was like a great sort of permanent search party out there for the best ideas, wherever sector they come from. Could be the private sector, could be the voluntary sector. It can actually be in the faith sector. Right? There's lots of good thinking out there. So you just got to bring it in and try and harness it in such a way that government becomes more effective. But, Ghana's at a very important moment in its future now. You've elected a new president. I think he's come in with a, big weight of expectation. We'll obviously help in any way we can. But I think we're better able to succeed today as governments if we realize that governing itself has certain ideas and principles that are grown up now that we can draw upon so that we govern well and not badly, and then our countries prosper and don't fail. Thank you.
When you were the Prime Minister of England, so we thank you for coming to share your experience. I was particularly very, very glad when you mentioned procurement, because that's my area of expertise. And as you may have heard or been briefed by your High Commissioner, His Excellency the President has created a new portfolio on procurement. And I happen to be the one that is to handle that portfolio. So there's been a few hula baloos about whether it's important or not. But just to also have your take on it, being in government in the UK for 10 years and knowing how procurement can be done either judiciously or otherwise, and whether you can make savings for government as we do so in a judicious manner. Do you think that a portfolio of mine is that relevant? So I can get swollen-headed a bit. So that's just on a lighter note, but it's a pleasure to meet you. And if I can have your take, I know there are other jurisdictions like Canada. Canada has a woman who is the Minister for Public Services and Procurement. But we want to hear from the UK experience as well. Thank you.
Sure. Do you want to take 2 or 3 at a time?
Yes. John, that's the High Commissioner for the
Yeah.
UK.
Good afternoon. I liked your, Tony, I liked your metaphor about you can buy 100 tables wisely or stupidly. One latter example is buying 100 tables but only receiving 10 but being invoiced for another 90, which leads on to the issue of corruption fighting, which is one of the stated priorities of the government here. And I wonder, from the examples of the many countries you cited, what you think the key planks could be to actually make a difference to something that's quite embedded politically but also culturally, and what really would make the difference to get to where Rwanda is now, which is reputedly now one of the least corrupt places on the continent, and has achieved that in a very short time. Thank you.
But to the point. And I was just wondering, the 8 countries that you're dealing with on the continent, are those some of the ones you've mentioned? And if so, have you changed your opinion on your views regarding the way we practice politics on the continent and how it has affected the rate at which we should be developing, given that Rwanda could be seen as perhaps the ideal?
Let's go with this.
Oh, right, sorry. Yes, sorry, my name is Dr. Zanetta Ajiman-Rawlings. I'm the Member of Parliament for the Klote-Kole constituency.
Sure. So just maybe to answer those 3, I mean, yeah, no, of course procurement matters. So your head should probably only swell once you actually do it effectively. But yeah, no, of course it does, because you spend a large amount of money doing it. And around the world today, Canada is one example. We changed a lot of our rules in the UK on procurement. But you can look at really good practice. Singapore actually is very, very good on this. You can also get the right advice from the outside, from business, for example. I mean, the thing about procurement is you're going out, even though you're a government, you're going out into the marketplace and buying the goods. So, making sure that the price is competitive, making sure that the quality is good. This is what the private sector do day in, day out. And, I think the one thing I would say is once within the ministry to work out, well, where can you make the biggest impact fastest? Okay, because one of the other things I think is really difficult about government is if you want to make reform, my experience of reform is that everyone agrees about it in general and everyone opposes it in particular. Okay, so you also need to be in a position where you're getting some quick wins as well. So if you can see where you might better save money quickly, you get that out there, and then you get a bit of confidence so that when you're doing things that are painful, because you have suppliers to government, it won't like it if you start pushing them down on price or making them compete. But obviously you've got to do that. And that leads me to the corruption question, which John was asking. You see, I think with corruption, and this is a problem for all countries at different stages of development. It's been a problem, for Western countries in earlier stages of their development. So there are 2 ways of going after corruption, and you probably need to have both. mean, one is obviously you need to go after those people who are engaged in corruption. But I actually think the single most important thing on corruption is to minimize the opportunity for it. And that's through minimizing the bureaucracy. Where there's heavy bureaucracy, there's going to be corruption. So the best thing is actually to change the rules around things. Like, you know, if you've got a very simple way of incorporating companies, it's hard for people then to start demanding money to do that. You know, if your planning system works effectively, you know, these are basic things that make countries go or not. And, you know, I mentioned Singapore a moment ago, but, you know, it's really worth, I mean, Singapore was a country, it's an interesting country. And you can't replicate Singapore, you know, as a whole, but it's interesting because I used to know Lee Kuan, the late Lee Kuan Yew, extremely well. And I talked with him a lot about politics, and he, in my view, was actually one of the first, what I would call post-ideological leaders, in the sense that he just wanted to get the right answer. He didn't really care whether it was left or right, particularly. And, you know, he took really basic decisions, but some of them were quite interesting in the context of developing countries. Because when Singapore was put out of Malaysia, they were effectively kicked out of Malaysia in the 60s. Okay. So they had the port facility, obviously, but they didn't have much else. So he took a number of interesting decisions, but they're interesting not for the decisions themselves, but what they show about the attitude of mind. So first of all, even though he'd had a really bad relationship with Britain as the former colonial master type of thing, he decided to get the best people to come and help him from around the world. He didn't care whether they were British, whatever they were, American, whoever they were, they didn't care. So anyone who said to him, no, we can't have those people, we can't have these people, he just said, I don't care. If we've got the best people, we have the best people. Secondly, he said, and this is a distinction with Malaysia, by the way, because Malaysia didn't do this, but he decided to do it. He said, how do we get connected? Everyone learns the English language. It was hugely fought over at the time. People went crazy. They said, no, we should be learning our ethnic tongues and all the rest of it. He said, look, you know, we need this country out in the world. So, and the third thing is, by the way, he said, when it comes to security and law and order, the citizen's going to be safe walking around the streets. It's very basic things. Actually, there's a fourth thing, which is interesting from a religious perspective. He said there's got to be no religious discrimination. We're not ending up with, you know, or ethnic discrimination with Chinese and Malays and Muslims and Protestants, you know. Right. So it's interesting as a frame of mind. So that's a bit of a diversion from where we were on bureaucracy. But the point about bureaucracy is that the more you minimize it, the less opportunity there is for corruption. And, you know, bureaucracies, all countries have a problem with bureaucracy, all countries. And, you know, if you're in government, you spend a lot of your time fighting it, but it's hard to fight. But that is the best way. And so, for example, if you have a set of rules for procurement, you can have less corruption, especially if there's an independent assessor that those rules are being implemented, for example, which you can do very easily. Right. The third thing is on how we practice the politics. Well, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, I suppose my conclusion is that I'm optimistic about Africa because I think a lot of the old thinking has actually disappeared. So I'm quite optimistic. But I do think that this governance issue, we could just do a lot more of it. And I actually think with the donor community's been slow to catch up with the need to build institutional capacity as the most important thing.
Mention Rwanda as a success story. And Ethiopia has been put in that same category. But Rwanda doesn't have a particularly good human rights record. My area of human rights. When it comes to political tolerance as well as freedom of expression. It has led some people to propound a theory that in Africa, in order to have rapid development, you have to sacrifice some human rights. What's your take on that? Well, short, and I'm a retired human rights commissioner.
Mr. Ricketts.
Very much, and thank you, Prime Minister. My name is Kweku Ricketts-Hagen, Member of Parliament for Cape Coast South. Thank you very much for the presentation, and welcome once again to Ghana. I'm sitting here thinking I should have had this presentation 4 years ago. But never mind. But the question I want to ask you is, having set your priorities, you're getting your policies and all that right, you realize that in government, events, things happen that you haven't prioritized, that you haven't planned for, and that those things then become the things that you have to deal with. You realize that they are coming at you almost every day. How do you deal with that and still be able to get back to your priorities and you're getting your policies right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my name is Kojo Yangson. I'm a journalist here in Accra. I'd like to add my voice to all of those who have thanked you for that very insightful delivery. Now, as you were speaking, I kept attempting to fit everything you were saying into our local context. I wanted to feel assured that what you were saying would work here in Ghana. And there was something you said that had me worried. You talked about your experience of having to bang the system over the head to make it work, and then you realized that wasn't the way, so you put in policies to ensure that it would have that self-replicating effect. I thought about how that would work here in Ghana. And our former president, Rawlings, when he was still a military leader, after he'd taken over leadership through his second coup d'etat, was asked by the international press whether this time around he intended to hand over power as quickly as he did the first time. His answer was that he intended to hand over power, but by the time he walked away, he wanted to make sure that if even the devil took over from him, they wouldn't be able to cheat the people. So pretty much what you're describing. But we see ourselves now, several decades since he made that declaration, still struggling with a system that allows our leaders to do a little too much of what they like without any consequences. So I'm wondering, when you look at a country like Ghana, where there are far less incentives to do the right thing amongst leadership, how do you envisage that we can impress upon these leaders to do what is not in their favor, which is essentially give up some of their power so that they can be checked, so that they can then be motivated to put in these policies that will create that self-replicating effect? Thank you.
Yeah, well, those are three great questions.
At the University of Ghana, I'm actually looking externally. That how do you envisage countries like Ghana beginning to prepare for a war which is now extremely, with the rise of right-wing governments and Brexit? So in the post-Brexit war, how do we, considering the fact that we still need to develop and move along, but we are now going into a changing world with everything changing, the rules are being rewritten. How do we focus on what is needed now, whilst at the same time trying to plan for a future which really is extremely not clear?
Thank you.
Your presentation was very concise and directly that it cut across all countries. But I also want to ask concerning external forces, and that is, in as much as government has so much doing, they prioritize, they are going along the line of what is their priority. But issues of terrorism within and outside, how will such a government be able to put its thoughts together to go ahead with issues that are of priority to this country? My name is Adekombi, Acting High Commissioner of Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Manson is here.
And there's a school of thought, actually, that Trump is preparing to hand over the baton of world leadership to China. Looking at the way he's carrying on, and what are the implications broadly on this new world order for Africa? implications. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Mansa Nete. I'm the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank.
Mine is a very simple question from a young politician's perspective. You don't always get it right in politics. Sometimes, despite your best intentions and how deep your policies may be, you get it flat out wrong. In those instances, what's been your experience? Is it best to level up with everybody, or try an adaptation of the error into what may be the better path later? Thank you.
Yeah. Those are all great questions, I have to say. So we've got 7. So now the challenge is great answers, but let me try and be frank with you about the human rights. It's actually it's kind of human rights, democracy. Is there a versus efficiency at a certain point? Okay, that's the question in a way. Is there at a certain point a clash between the necessity for the strong leadership and the need for basic civil and human rights? And I like to think there isn't, although sometimes I worry that in certain stages of development there is, if I'm being really honest about it. So I think Rwanda's a very special case because they came out of a genocide. And I think it was very, very difficult for a traditional democracy to work in that context. I guess you could say Singapore, though, was not a traditional democracy either, although it's kind of evolved into something very close to it now, I would say. South Korea is an example of a country that is a democracy and actually does pay attention to human rights. So I hope there isn't a contradiction. But I do think, and this is one of the problems with Western politics right now, and it does come back to this issue of governance and getting things done. There is a feeling, I think a big part of the Trump success in America is not a lot of the things people think. It's that in circumstances where a lot of Americans thought their system was broken, he said, I'm just going to fix it. Now, whether he can or not is another matter, by the way. But I do think if democracy is to work, and I'm including the notions of basic human rights in that, there's an obligation on the Democrats to make sure they're also effective governors. And they're not so lost in politicking that they lose sight of what they're supposed to be there for. Right? And I think that's I would say it's an inherent risk in the democratic process. So I hope the answer to your question is no, there isn't a contradiction, although I think it's an open question in some ways. The thing about unplanned events is a great point. It was Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, who was asked what was the most difficult thing about being Prime Minister, and he said events. But this is the importance. You see, you often end up with a dual-track presidency. Now, I've had this conversation with the President of Nigeria, for example. I had a dual-track prime ministership myself after 9/11. And this is the importance of the structure that allows you to deliver the basic things. Because, a lot of these events, by the way, come in and go out. Some of them obviously make their mark on the world, but I can't tell you the amount of time I spent on things that today I can't even remember what they were about. But they were, there'd be scandals, or there'd be, I spent 6 months of my premiership dealing with foot and mouth disease in the UK because we had I think it was the biggest. I got to the stage where I knew more about foot and mouth disease than I ever wanted to know, but than virtually anyone. But when that event was there, I had to deal with it. Now, post 9/11, I had to spend a lot of time on foreign policy. But I had by then established a system that meant that all the time that was carrying on even if I was temporarily distracted. And that's the importance of this governance stuff, because the events will come. And you can't tell, they could be a regional thing. And the president could end up spending days and weeks dealing with it. But if he's got a system in place with a proper mechanism for enforcement and performance management, then you can still carry on governing. I mean, I think, you know, in answer to the question about the incentives for those in power to do the right thing, it's just, there is no answer to that question. I mean, people either, you know, want the best for their country or not. The only thing I say is, because since you're a journalist, is that part of the thing you realize in government is that people will often misrepresent your motives even when you're actually trying to do the right thing. But, you know, as I always say to people, the thing about being in government, you know, in opposition you can please all of the people all of the time. But in government, when you decide, you divide. And the harder the decision, the more the division. So, you know, but I think in the end there is no, it's one of the things you hope about democracy. At the end, you are elected people trying to do their best. Sometimes they fail, but there's no substitute for the motive if the motive's not right. But I do think it's important always for people to realize, it's one of the things I think in democracy people have to understand, that governing is difficult, and that people who are in positions of government, even if they do things you think are wrong or you disagree with, it's important at least to respect why they're trying to do them. The thing that I think is unforgivable for a leader is not to take the decision. You know, and you do come across leadership that does this, they just exist. You know, government is just a daily existence. It should be a mission. On the populism and Brexit and the world situation, I think this is the fourth and sixth question, to China as well. I mean, look, I don't think this will affect Ghana too dramatically, to be honest. And even in the UK context, although I passionately did disagree with Brexit, the truth is the UK government's going to be wanting as many trading partners as they can have. So I wouldn't worry about Ghana. I think, per se, I mean, if Brexit was followed by a French election and Frexit, that would be, then I'd be talking to you differently. I don't think that will happen. I hope it doesn't happen, but, you know, who knows? As I'd say, you know, when I go around the world today, you know, people say to me, you've had all this experience in politics, so predict what's going to happen. I said, I gave up that game in 2016. I said, you might as well actually ask me what I think and then do the opposite, because you're more likely to get it right. So I think with China, by the way, you know, China also will have to do its reforms and changes. I mean, I think Xi Jinping showed enormous chutzpah in going to Davos and saying those things. But, you know, let's be clear. The Chinese market's not completely open to foreign companies. So, but in the end, I think China has a huge interest, as we all do, in an open trading system. And, you know, the one lesson that's clear from the world economy over the past 30, 40 years is that more commerce and trade, the better for everybody, really. And terrorism, yeah, look, this is, I mean, this is a problem everywhere. I tell you, my view very simply is this, that you obviously have to do whatever you can in security terms, but I think the root of this is an ideology that politicizes religion in a sectarian way. And today's world only works by people reaching out across boundaries of culture and faith, and we need to educate our young people, particularly, to an open-minded view of the world. But it's this ideology that then latches itself onto issues of poverty and deprivation and turns it into a religious cause, which is obviously very, very damaging. But I think, you know, we need to bring the world together around that, and to be, I actually have had a lot of conversations, not just with this administration, but the previous one and with governments in Europe about how we coordinate much better on fighting terrorism, both in security terms. But I mean, I would also like to see what I call a global commitment on education, so that countries commit to removing cultural prejudice and promoting cultural tolerance in their education systems. Because in far too many countries of the world, even in the curriculum of the state, there is prejudice. So, and finally, all the mistakes, what goes wrong, yeah. Well, Bill Gates once said to me that he regarded every mistake as a learning opportunity. And I think that's probably right. And what you do when things do go wrong is, I think you've got to correct and learn from them, for sure. You know, in foreign policy particularly, I learned the hard way some of the difficulties when you remove dictatorships and what happens afterwards, which is why when the Arab Spring began, I was much more cautious than other people were. And certainly I learned a lot about reform and change inside government. But I think that, here's a sort of bold thing to say by way of conclusion to this, I think, you know, it's better always to have a clear sense of dynamism and mission in the government. Now, if you're trying to make big change, sometimes those changes won't work. And I think one of the things you've got to do in government is adjust when they don't, you know, so that you don't just carry on blindly, you know, down that path. But this is why having the ability in government, you know, to learn the best lessons from around the world and try and apply them is so important. And, you know, what I learned from my time in government on the reform side was that there was a pattern I got into with reform, where when a reform was first proposed, everyone hated it. When I was doing the reform, it was hell. And after I'd finished the reform, I wish I'd done more of it. And I do think you're more likely to go wrong today by caution than by boldness. But on verra.
That we've had a very insightful as well as very interesting discussion. So on behalf of the IEA, at this point I'd like to say a very big thank you to you for sharing these great experiences with us here today. And I'm sure we have a lot to digest going forward. And to you, distinguished guests here today, we thank you for the privilege of your time. And at this point I'll say thank you.
Right Honorable Tony Blair, you are most welcome to Ghana, and we hope you are having a nice time with us. You are on record to have said somewhere in 2015 that Africa is the most exciting continent on the planet because of its opportunities. Right here in Ghana, how can we position ourselves? In fact, how best can we position ourselves to make the world realize our potential, to invest in Ghana, as well as help us accelerate job creation? Thank you.
Sure. So, you know, I've worked on Africa for a long time. When I was Prime Minister,
and I was leader of the G8 nations. In 2005, we put Africa at the center of the G8. We created the Department for International Development. We trebled aid from the UK. But today, in my post-prime ministerial work, there's a different concept, which is a concept of how we help countries to take their own destiny into their own hands. And right now, Ghana, has got big challenges for sure. Challenges around its budget deficit, challenges around the power sector, challenges around agriculture, education, industrialization. But there is an enormous amount of goodwill internationally towards Ghana today. The Ghanaian people are respected people. This country has huge potential. It's got resources that it can develop and exploit. And what is necessary is that it sets the country on the right path now to take the difficult decisions and to improve the lives of people. And if we can help from the governance initiative in any way with that process, we will. But I'm very confident about Ghana. I think the Ghanaian people should be confident about the country. And right now is the moment for understanding that potential and developing it, and knowing that whatever the challenges, there is a genuine opportunity if the correct decisions are taken and the right focus is there.
Thank you. Right. Reliance on aid to trade. And in fact, our president was out of the country in Geneva last week, also echoing the same point, that we need to move away from our heavy dependence on foreign aid. But I'd like to know your thoughts on this. How can we move away from aid if countries such as yours are protecting their markets from African products with trade barriers and subsidies and the like?
So, aid is important. And as I say, when I was Prime Minister, we trebled aid. But today you can learn the lessons of good governance from around the world. For example, if you're trying to bring in investment, you need a minimum of bureaucracy, you need transparent rules, you need to make sure that you're fighting things like corruption, you need to make sure that you're developing the infrastructure so that business can come in. These are lessons that around the world where they're applied, countries succeed. And yes, of course, you've got to open up Western markets as well. And actually, Britain, which is still part of the European Union as we speak, we have been advocating within Europe a much more open approach to African trade. So yes, of course, you need to knock down those trade barriers with the West. But by the way, you also need to knock down some of the trade barriers, tariff and non-tariff, between the neighboring countries. There's so much more that could be done in the trade that goes across this part of Africa. So all of these things, what I'm saying is we kind of know what we should do. The challenge is doing it. And whatever sector you're talking about, industrialization, the power sector, agriculture, the great thing is to learn the best lessons from around the world, what's working, what's not, and apply those lessons.
Thank you.
Right. Funnily enough, as I get older, I'm less keen on that. I actually think you should elect the best person, whether they're younger or they're older. With youth can come vigor, but with age come experience. The best thing is to have vigor and experience, but I mean, I don't favor the age limit. I favor the right of the people to decide, and they should decide on the basis of the best person, whatever their age, whatever their gender.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. Who next? Wendy.
Well, I think NEPAD was important because it articulated a principle which was one of partnership between the developed nations and developing nations. And it was important because it had a method of assessing whether people were making progress. So I think NEPAD has in part been successful. But, I think we need to take the concept further. Germany, for example, in the G20 this year is looking at a compact for change and investment. And I think the best ideas today, whether NEPAD or other ideas, the best ideas are those that involve a partnership of equals between the developed and the developing world. We've both got a lot to gain from that type of partnership, but ultimately, whether a country like Ghana succeeds will be up to Ghanaians. In the end, we can help. The developed world can help, or it can hinder. And let's hope it helps. But ultimately, your success lies in your hands. You will make your country succeed. No one else can be substituted for that. And that kind of principle of partnership rather than donor-recipient, is, I think, the better way forward. And that's what was behind NEPAD. And, I'm in favor of developing NEPAD further, but I think we should be looking at different ways of partnering.
Thank you very much. Okay, so
to vote for Brexit, because there have been arguments that the voters were not really aware of the true terms of Brexit. So I want to know, what at all do you think they were aware about that made them want to vote to leave the EU?
How long have you got? Look, to be absolutely honest, I think I'm probably best talking about Brexit back in the UK rather than in Ghana. But I think there is a general anxiety today in the world about the pace of change and about globalization. People worry about it. They worry because with globalization comes economic change. Technology changes the way we live and work, displaces jobs. Next generation of technology will displace even more people. People worry economically, and they worry culturally. Because what happens in a world of globalization is the world moves closer together. Okay, so you cross these boundaries of ethnicity and culture and faith. So people worry about that too. My only point, whether on Brexit or any of the debates in Europe at the moment, my point is very simple. The answer to these challenges of globalization is not to shut the world down. It's to open it up, but to help people through the process of change. And this is why things like education and skills and infrastructure are really important today. A modern industrial strategy is really important, but that's the answer, not to retreat from the world. And, frankly, that's part of the answer here in Ghana. I mean, one of the reasons why your new president made education such a big priority is because the more educated you are, the better able you are to handle this world of change. But when politics becomes dangerous is when it sells people what is essentially something that is false, namely that this world of change is going to stop. It's not. It's going to carry on intensifying. And the challenge for governments, whether in Ghana or in Britain or in France or in America, wherever it is, the challenges for government are the same. How do you help people through the process of change? How do you access the benefits of globalization and minimize its risks? I mean, when we do this press conference now, if I was doing this when I first came into power in 1997, it would be a 24-hour news cycle. People in the UK would kind of get to know if I'd said something the next day. They're going to know in 30 seconds. So this world is completely different. We all live and work differently today, don't we? And we think differently as a result. So I understand why people get frightened by that process of change. It frightens me sometimes. But I do think the world is better when it opens up. And if you look at all the progress there's been, think of when you've made progress in Ghana. How's it been? Right, it's been, you secure your independence. You just had your 60 years anniversary. There's a lot of teething problems and difficulties in that process. But, the country has come a long way, but it's got a long way to go. But all the changes that you want to make here in Ghana today, they're going to be changes that equip the people of the country to be able to handle that process of change. They're never going to be about closing the country down, shutting off its borders, turning its back on the world. It's always going to be about making sure that Ghanaians feel comfortable and confident. Right. Now, there's a lot of things the government has to do in order to make that happen. But that's the way forward for the world. And this is why I think, we can make globalization work for people, but it's a big, big mistake if we try and shut it down, because it won't be shut down and will make a lot of people worse off in the process of trying to shut it down.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I'm sorry, due to time constraints, we cannot take any more questions.
And just to say, I visited Ghana when I was Prime Minister. I'm now back as a former Prime Minister, but I'm still as passionate as ever about the country, about its potential, and about the work that myself and my organisation do in Africa. And if there's any way at all we can help the journey of change that you're embarked upon here, with the new President, we will be honoured to do so. And thank you very much indeed for coming and listening.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.